On certain days where we want to paint an outdoor scene, but it's raining and makes it hard, or impossible to do watercolor, but we can take from our observations and studies and contrive a painting that effectively communicates this idea of rain. And one of the things that we use to do that is edges, the edges of our shapes, the way we use edges to convey shininess or deep reflections or inclement weather, clouds, etc. And using a variety of edges in any watercolor is always a good idea. With these rainy scenes, I tend to use more soft edges, more blended edges, and graded washes as well to communicate the soft nature of the day. When it's a rainy day, I see a lot of soft edges, a lot of deeper colors, and the atmosphere also has sort of a softness to it. That's something that I would like to convey. I'm starting the exercise with a tonal study, and in that study you can see I'm working on the profile of the Trinity Church, and I've really reduced all that interesting tile work, windows, other ornaments, gargoyles, everything to sort of this stark shape. And it's a good start to the painting because I'm most concerned with sort of the grandeur, the power of the Trinity Church as a structure, and how it kind of not looms but is ever present when you're down in Copley Square. And at the same time, I want to show it in a state of being wet against a sort of flat sky. So I've kept it very much as a silhouette. And I'm going to now, while it's wet, add some other pigment so that I can get shapes within shapes, so that I can get a feeling of the perspective, so that I can start to indicate reflections in the pavement, all this with a variety of strokes. So you can see the initial wash is dried quite light, and I've integrated some clouds into the background. I've integrated a distant building as well as the former John Hancock building. That's how I know it. I think it has a different name now on the right-hand side. Very modern building, also a beautiful structure, and on any day it's reflecting everything around it. So these two buildings, they create this sort of canyon, or in the case of my painting, this bright passage. And this bright passage is where I tend to show my figures coming through that light. These dark figures are pushing everything back in the painting and creating even more drama in the scene. And these figures, as well as some of the windows and accents that I'm adding to the church itself, are painted on dry paper. But they're painted with sort of rough edges so that they feel broken. The strokes feel broken, the edges of the shapes feel a little broken. And this helps to create a couple of things. One is it's much less static. It has a little more interest to it. And it also succeeds in creating a feeling of animation, as though the figures are moving or as though the clouds are moving. Even some of the shimmering effects on the pavement or on the distant Hancock building appear to be in transition. So it's a way to build yet another a communication of something that's moving or transitory. Finishing up some of the upper section, and it really is a beautiful structure. In a way, it's sort of a shame not to paint all those things. I tried to get the essence of the building itself with the turret on the far right, and a suggestion of windows, a suggestion of the perspective, but primarily a backdrop to the figures coming across that glittering, shiny brickwork that's in the front of the church. I'll return to this and give a few highlights to pick up some of the figures that are lost or kind of residing in the misty area. And this helps create a little mystery, also a little feeling of changing light, and all works together, I think, to give us a sort of dynamic portrayal. The rainy day scene to me is quite beautiful. I paint them a lot, and I enjoy that sort of mood that they create. So this is the finished piece. A few very light colors were added to the figure and the umbrella, but you can see how the contrast of that bright passage against the dark figures really helps to draw your attention there. And then you climb upward into the sky, into the upper parts of the building. So now we translate this into colors. But yes, since it's a rainy day, the colors are rather muted. I think for this painting I'm using a burnt sienna, ultramarine blue, and some colors for the pavement in burnt sienna also, and a little of this turquoise green. The Hancock Center always seems to have this greenish hue to it, and it complements all the burnt sienna that I'm using, so I'm going to play on that. Again, thinking about that profile of the building, the big shape, and how the big shape changes from top to bottom. Towards the top, it's a bit lighter and a bit heavier towards the bottom. And this helps to keep a feeling of sort of mist or moisture in the air if we fade it off towards the top. A lot of people will start in the sky, and often I do. In this case, I'm working on the structure first, knowing that I can apply the sky and emphasize certain areas along the edge of the building based on how I structure the clouds, or the openings, I should say, the openings in the clouds. I'm trying to evoke some dry brush here on that building of the Hancock Center, and also trying to get a bit of a graded wash, so I'm using it a little lighter on top and adding a little more color towards the bottom. I'll even put a reflection of the adjacent building into the lower section to create some interest. But this will be done while the paint is wet, so that we have soft edges. Soft edges are indicative of a rainy day, so every opportunity we have to use them, we do. And now I want to evoke more dry brush and a feeling of that sort of shiny quality in the pavement below where I'm going to put the figures, especially through that little passage of light. I want there to be more or less brightness through there. So I'm adding burnt sienna, then I'm going back with a burnt sienna with a little bit of neutral tint to strengthen the foreground, and also to, in a way, join it to the bigger shape so that it feels more integrated. It feels more almost like one piece. And this, in the end, will create strength in my image. This is a distant building, sort of a way to concentrate light in the foreground. There are buildings behind all of these buildings, and I'm choosing this one to put in. I could put in others, but I might lose the profile of the Trinity Church. So now I'm adding clouds to focus on the peak of that small turret. I want to sort of mask or mute the higher peak, make it recede a little more into the mist, or feel further away, but I definitely want this turret, the strong one that kind of comes across in front of that white area, to be more visible, more obvious, and take a little more precedence in the final image. So this is the advantage of putting in the clouds later on, is you have a little more control and a little more the clouds can actually have more relevance to the whole painting when we do that. Now we're putting in the figures, starting with blobs, and I'm spacing them to get a feeling of perspective. My main figures are just entering that light passage, and they're kind of flanked by other figures, some with umbrellas, some striding through the scene. I was pleased with the first rendition, the spacing and organization of the figures, because I felt it created depth and interest in the painting. So I'm trying to emulate that to some degree, putting in tiny figures to give a feeling of the scale, and complement those with some figures that are coming closer to us and then walking through that light area. This scene is developed a little differently in that I'm putting more of a family in the spotlight, especially the younger girl who's got a red raincoat is going to be sort of the emphasis or the main focal point in this painting. And you can tell as these figures come into play, as they start to find their way into the scene, all that shape of the Trinity Church and the Hancock building is receding further and further away. We're starting to feel a mist in the air, and that's what I'm looking for in the long run, is trying to get a feeling of atmosphere to the whole painting. One thing when we're placing figures, especially many figures like this, we want to do a few figures, our main figures, sort of in the midground, where we can really utilize contrast and hard edges and bright color to make them stand out. We want to surround them with figures to make it feel natural. They can't be the only ones in the painting, so we surround it with more grouped figures that are kind of touching each other, and in the background certainly smaller, a little paler, in the foreground larger, but I tend to put these larger figures on the periphery or on the edges of the painting so that they do the job of creating depth, but they don't take over the scene. And this figure that's walking through the scene on the lower left is going to be my largest figure. And I'm taking some steps not to completely finish it. We'll notice the shoulders and the head and the torso, even a bag that's being carried, but he'll appear to be fading away also. So from this point, it's sort of adjusting. I put in some windows, some indication of architecture into the Hancock building and also into Trinity Church, and playing with color and edges in these dry figures, making sure that we get a feeling of naturalness to them, ease. And I find it's important to let these shapes be incomplete. And by that I mean not every edge is complete. Often I'll let the legs sort of disappear or appear and disappear so that it feels animated. And do the same thing with arms and sometimes other parts of the clothing, or if they're carrying something. I've added these reflections, which really help a lot in this case. They help to create a perspective. They also help to create that feeling of a rainy day. And that's the painting.